Places, everybody.
And action. Hello. Welcome back to Show and Tell. And if you're a new viewer, let me introduce myself. I'm Billy, and I am from New York. Now, that voice that you just heard, inviting everyone to take their place, I'm not sure who that man was expecting, because at the moment, it's just me. He must have thought that Ella Fitzgerald was here along with me, because he might have heard strains of autumn in New York. It is autumn in New York, which means we put on our tippet and we get our sweaters on in preparation for the big New York Sheep and Wool Festival, aka Rhinebeck, which sadly isn't taking place this year. I know that many of you are missing that. This would have been my Rhinebeck sweater. So let me tell you a little bit about it before my guest arrives. It's called Evening in Edinburgh. It's by Casapinka. The collar, which is attached, is all seed stitch, as is the button band and the cuff on the sleeves. This goes all the way down. I don't know if you'll be able to see me full length. Let me see, but you might get the idea. It's to about the knee, and there's seed stitch around the bottom as well. It was really a delight to knit, all mostly stockinette, pretty straight knitting. And this is one of the things that I was able to complete during lockdown this year. Fortunately, I purchased this yarn from Neighborhood Fiber Co. at Vogue Knitting Live in January here in New York, as well as these fantastic vintage buttons from Dusty Vintage Buttons. And you can see that I used a couple of strands of the yarn so I could get perfect match. And I thought that that little crisscross kind of replicated seed stitch, so I thought that was a nice touch. I was super happy with these. You know, I had the yarn with me, I had the pattern with me, I knew how large the buttonhole was going to be, and I was able to buy my buttons right there on the spot. I have a couple of vintage things going on, some earrings and bracelets that I wanted to share with you. And because it is autumn and it is New York, I thought you might enjoy seeing one of my acquisitions, since you know that I don't do stash, but I do eat chocolate, and I love to give boxed sets of chocolate when I go to someone's home as a little gift. So these are the Harvest collection found at Trader Joe's, my favorite store. Luckily, it's only a couple of blocks from where I live. So you have pumpkin, and you have a little acorn and maize, all the seasonal goodies that we would find here in New York. Let's see, you should know that you can find me on Ravelry as Billy Toy, and on Instagram also as Billy Toy, and I'll put that on the screen so you'll see the spelling of it. For new viewers, welcome. So happy to have you. My podcast is largely about vintage knitting, sometimes vintage inspired. Like, this isn't purely vintage, but I thought it was rather inspired by it. I thought the silhouette was kind of a vintage silhouette, especially with this little bow. But some of my guests actually do knit from vintage patterns, as have I. So from time to time I'll have guests on, and today you're going to be treated to a guest, and I'm not going to tell you anything about her because it's a really big surprise. Where she's from is kind of in keeping with today's theme. In the background, you see this Art Deco decanter. This was a wedding gift from friends of my family who had had it in their family for at least a couple of generations. Let me bring a piece closer for you to see. I think the designer's name is Karl Palda. I think he's Czech. I really should check on that, and I'll put it here. The black chevrons are actually in the glass. It's not painted on or anything. it is the color of the glass there. So there's a set of 6 shot glasses and the beautiful decanter. It's really fragile, so I'm not going to pick that up and bring it to you, but I wanted you to see how pretty those are. I love this. And even though it was used and loved by a family and not in mint condition, I was very, very thrilled to have it as a wedding gift. Okay, so we got the basic things out of the way. You know how to find me. I also have started a Ravelry group. It's not caught on yet, but hopefully by the time you're watching this, there'll be some more people there. And it's called Show and Tell. And I think those are the basic things I needed to tell you. And I'll be back in a short while with my guest. Okay, here we are, we're recording, and I'm going to let my guest Julia introduce herself and tell us the town that she's from and why it has something to do with Rhinebeck. So Julia, go ahead.
Hi guys, my name is Julia and I actually live in a little town called Pleasant Valley, New York, and I'm about 20 minutes south of Rhinebeck. So it's literally around the corner for me, and it's a place that we like to go and visit often, especially the Sheep and Wool Festival when it's in the area. And right now it's actually a beautiful time of year because all the leaves are just starting to change right now. So it's like that picturesque Hudson Valley look where everything's just starting to turn like crimson, reds, and oranges and yellows right now. So it's really pretty.
So next year, everybody, remember, you're going to try and make it to Rhinebeck because this pandemic will be history and long forgotten come October 2021, right?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. How are things there? Are people feeling that, like, let down? I mean, we are in the rest of the world, but the locals are, I mean, is it really hurting them that it's not happening?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think it might, especially like some of the smaller bed and breakfast type places, because there are quite a few of those in the area. And I do know like a lot of the hotels in those smaller kind of B&Bs would definitely book up and get busy for people coming into the area for the show. Especially, you know, like this, you know, when people go up into Saugerties the first few days before the actual festival down in Rhinebeck. You know, there's the Kingston area. So there's, I think, a couple of the smaller businesses like restaurants and stuff that actually might be a little hurt by the event not being there. But I wouldn't know for sure how that works for them. I do know a lot of people, like vendor-wise, are very upset because that is,
of course,
that's like their big, like they do lots of festivals throughout the year, but the vendors, that is like that's their big money maker. And I know that I know that they're trying to do like a virtual Sheep and Wool, so I'm not quite sure if that's going to draw in, you know, what they would normally expect from everyone being there.
Can't possibly, and it's a real pity. And for me, especially because this would have been my first Rhinebeck, I've come back to knitting after a couple decades hiatus, so I don't think Rhinebeck was happening my last go-round of knitting. Anyway, before we get off the topic of your little town, Pleasant Valley, it sounds so pleasant. Is it in a valley? Yeah. What is there that next year when everybody descends on Rhinebeck, they should drive 20 minutes south to experience? Is there something like particular about your little village that we shouldn't miss?
I don't know if there's anything, like you can drive in and out of Pleasant Valley pretty quickly. And I'm kind of like in one of those areas where I kind of like fall in between a lot of little different hamlets. So there's like Pleasant Valley and there's Salt Point and Clinton Corners. And so there's a couple of, you know, like you blink and you've already missed it, very small kind of places. We definitely have some really, because they're such old little towns, one of the things that's just really I personally enjoy just driving through them this time of year with all of the fall foliage, but you have a lot of those really old colonial houses that are like right along the road. And so I really just love looking at the old houses and admiring the old houses that are in the area, because this is obviously, a very old area. And so I do like to visit a lot of the older homes and a lot of the historic homes in the area. So close by, you do have the FDR estate, which is close by, the home of the president.
So you're near, I didn't realize
Yeah.
it was near that. And the Culinary Institute, the CIA.
The Culinary Institute. There's also Valkill, which was the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. And then one of the other beautiful houses, which is actually right there just outside of Rhinebeck, which I don't know if too many people know about, is Wilderstein, which is another historic home that was actually falling into disrepair. And a lot of people spent a lot of money, and they've done a lot of fundraising, and they actually repainted the exterior of the home to its original colors. But Wilderstein was actually owned by FDR's cousins, and they were the ladies that lived there were the ones that gave him his dog Fala.
Oh, I haven't been there. I've been to some of the other homes in the area, Thomas Cole's house, and I forget the name of the place that has all this Tiffany tile work, mosaics. Olana? I think it's Olana up near Hudson.
Yeah, Olana. Yeah, Alana's a little bit further north. Besides the FDR estate in Hyde Park, you also have the Vanderbilt estate, which is one of my favorite mansions in the area. I've always loved that mansion since I was a little girl. When I was a little girl, and I used to do school tours, because the school district would always go take us on field trips to these places. I used to always pretend that like I lived in Vanderbilt Mansion, like that was my summer home, which I find interesting because a lot of these areas, a lot of these homes, with the exception of Wilderstein and obviously the FDR estate, the Vanderbilt Mansion here in the area was just a summer home. So it's just one of the many homes that the Vanderbilts owned that became like this little summer cottage that they would just come up here for 2 months, to enjoy the cool weather outside the city, and then they would be off to the next location. So there's quite a few beautiful historic homes in the area that you can visit that I just enjoy all year round.
Okay, so as much as I love to travel and I love going up the Hudson, we really got to talk about sweaters. That's the main reason why I invited you today. And we'll come back to the curio cabinet behind you.
Yeah.
Remind me at the end. Okay, so I know that there's a couple of Rhinebeck sweaters in your collection and some other things that you're going to show us. Remember to tell us what's vintage inspired versus what's knit from a vintage pattern.
Sure. So since we're talking about Rhinebeck, I'll share with you one of my first Rhinebeck sweaters, which is funny because I used to do, I think I went to my first Rhinebeck like 10 years ago, and I didn't really quite know what to expect, and I had only done it once, and then I never really went back. But then I started going back regularly about 3 or 4 years ago, but I didn't actually get into the Rhinebeck sweater craze until like 2 years ago, where
because Christy Glass started going like nuts with it.
I know, and it was just like I didn't even realize that it was a thing, and I was like, I want to be part of the excitement that is the Rhinebeck sweater. And so because I remember watching, where did I put that sweater? Did I bring it down here?
If you need to go and get it, I can pause the recording.
Where did I put those sweaters? Yeah, you might have to pause it.
Okay, no problem.
Woo! Yay! Actually, I should have put this one on the mannequin. Or I could put it on so people can see it because it's hard to hold up. Okay.
So is everything black and white? You're very black and white. Your home looks pretty black and white. The sweater you're holding up looks like it's shades of gray. Is that your aesthetic?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I like very dark, moody colors. There's a lot of black, gray, purple, raspberry colors. My house actually has more color than my wardrobe, and I kind of like it that way. It's total opposites. But my house is kind of dark in general, so I really kind of like the lighter, pieces of furniture and stuff to kind of help bring a little bit of more light into the room. But for the most part, everything I do is kind of on the dark, macabre kind of side.
Okay, we're getting to know you. Okay.
So we kind of celebrate it all year round. And my color palette is very limited.
Okay.
I've tried exploring with other colors, but they always seem to fall outside my wheelhouse and they make me uncomfortable. And then I know everyone else loves it, but it ends up becoming a piece that I never wear if it doesn't fall into like black, gray, purple, or like raspberry. But back to the Rhinebeck sweater discussion. This was my very first Rhinebeck sweater.
Wow.
This was my second color work knitted sweater. 2 years ago, I decided, let's try this color work thing, because I always saw people making these beautiful yoke sweaters, and I always wanted to try it. And then because this was my second sweater and we had to up the challenge, it was also my first steeking project. So steeking is when you knit it all in one piece and then you cut it to create it, to turn it into a cardigan. So is
this from a pattern, or is this your own design?
This is from a pattern that I actually altered. So the pattern had these beautiful swirls to it, but I actually took out the decorations that she originally had and I added the skulls and I added the bats to it. And then I used this cute little ghost ribbon on the inside to help hide the seams of where it is steeked. And I don't know if you can really see them, but I actually buy vintage buttons from the 50s off of Etsy. There's a couple really nice vintage button sellers on there. And so I tend to find a lot of my buttons on there to put on my cardigans. So this was my first Rhinebeck sweater that I absolutely love and adore. It's still my favorite today.
It suits you. Since we know something goth about you.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people who know me know that this is totally my aesthetic when they see it. And when I do like a lot of car shows and stuff and I need something to keep my my arms and everything covered in the morning when it's a little bit chilly, it all kind of makes sense, especially when I step out of our car at the shows. So that's my first Rhinebeck sweater, official Rhinebeck sweater. And then last year, I also decided to do another colorwork sweater. And this one was actually a regular sweater, but I added the steek to it. So I turned it from a regular sweater into a cardigan for last year.
Hang on 1 minute. Now I'm going to pause because I have the perfect necklace for this. I'll be right back. Okay.
Okay. Oh, that's gorgeous. Oh, I love that. That's beautiful.
I forget how they told me to say this in French. Ooh. It's something so beautiful, to the words for cobweb. I'll look it up and I'll put it on the screen because it's something I can't remember, but it's a very beautiful phrase in French, cobweb. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. So that's another Rhinebeck.
My second Rhinebeck sweater. Yeah.
Also
this
steeped?
is I hope I don't butcher her last name, but Andy Sutherland.
People are going to know who
This
you
one
are.
I added the steek to, so it was normally a sweater. Yeah, she designs a lot of retro-inspired knitwear. I've knit quite a few of her sweaters. This one on the back, you can't really quite see, is another one of hers. It's her Chuck sweater, and it has this beautiful cabling on the front. But the way that she writes her patterns are very easy to follow and understand, and they always seem to end at the right height, especially when you do wear like a lot of retro style clothing or dresses. So they tend to end a little higher at the natural waist than some of the more modern sweaters. This particular one she'd actually designed for last year. She had a whole kind of Halloween book of retro inspired knitwear from different sweaters and stuff. And this is her Arachne pattern, which I added the steek to it. So I turned it into a cardigan. I find that I tend to wear cardigans a lot more than actual, sweaters. Although I do find that that's kind of changing a little. And then again, I also found some really cute vintage buttons on Etsy to add to the sweater.
Nice.
So this was my, and it was fun too because she did a knit along last year for this. So there was quite a few of us who were wearing it to Rhinebeck last year. So I was trying to find everyone who had worn this sweater and was trying to take pictures with everyone so we could kind of like, be part of the Arachne sweater group, which was a lot of fun.
So do you wear some special undergarments? You said something before we were recording about.
I know. It's a warm day today in New York, but I usually do wear a lot of retro-inspired underpinnings. So a lot of the long line bras that you would wear, or that go all the way down to the waist. So it's already like wearing a whole long johns. I don't know, but when your brassiere actually ends at your waist. And then, all the other girdle and underpinnings underneath it, it already gets kind of warm, which is great for when you're walking around outside in October in Rhinebeck. It's a little extra, layer of warmth, because there's a couple of times up there where it has been bitterly cold walking around the fairgrounds.
I vaguely remember my mother having those long line bras, and I seem to recall that they hooked onto the girdle. So it was a continuous thing. Later on, I think they did onesies. But early in my life, I think there was two pieces hooked together. And then, oh my goodness, before pantyhose, you had the garter on the girdle to hold up your stockings. Oh.
Yeah. Which those are fun. It depends. But I remember my mom telling me stories of having to hook up my grandmother's long line bra, because it's like 20 little hooks and eyes back there.
Yeah.
And trying to reach back there and do all that, it becomes quite a challenge. You have to be a little bit flexible. But I do, and I know I'm not the only one who talks about those things, but I do think when it comes to retro style clothing or vintage style clothing, those underpinnings are actually really kind of important to help create that shape that you're looking for when it comes to wearing vintage knits or even vintage clothing. So I do find that they're helpful.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. That's a really important tip for my viewers and for me, because I really wouldn't have thought about that. So thank you. Now I have to go buy a long line bra.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of companies out there that do offer vintage inspired stuff, and then there are even some that I think are still companies in production that were even in production like when my grandmother
Maiden Form, I would think, is probably
Maiden
still doing
Form.
it.
I want to say, is it Rago or Rago? Rago also does a lot of shapewear. They've been around, I want to say, for well over 50 years. So there's a lot of different companies out there, but I do know that if there's a certain shape or style that you're looking for, that those underpinnings are really kind of important, structure-wise, to give you that shape that you're looking for under your vintage knits, or even your vintage inspired knits or your retro style clothes. To me, it definitely makes a difference, at least for me. It's not for everyone, but I personally enjoy it. Besides doing the Rhinebeck sweaters, last year, I feel like as a knitter, and I've only been knitting since about 2013, so I still kind of consider myself to be like a new knitter. I don't really consider myself to be as experienced a knitter as, say, other people like my mom, who's been knitting since she was like 5. But I'm always looking for new ways to kind of like challenge what I'm doing. And I do enjoy making sweaters and sweater construction. So I would say for probably like the last 6 or 7 months, I've been really exploring the world of vintage knitting and knitting from vintage patterns, which is interesting and very challenging at the same time. It's almost very intimidating to knit from a vintage pattern, because you know, you purchase a sweater pattern these days and it's like 20 pages and everything is like detailed and intricate and explains everything to you. And then you buy like a vintage knitting book and you see this picture of this beautiful sweater, and then the pattern design is like 3 paragraphs.
For one size, maybe 2 or 3 if you're lucky.
And it's just kind of, which led me to, you know, believe that whole thing that vintage knitting is more like guidelines than actual rules. It's just kind of like, here's an idea, and if you kind of follow this idea, you'll have a sweater. So I was doing a lot of research and stuff, because there are quite a few like Pinterest boards and stuff that help you understand vintage knitwear. I do say if vintage knitting is something that you're interested in, I would definitely make sure you're familiar with at least sweater construction or sewing construction, because it's almost like modern knitwear, it's all knit in one piece, but vintage knitwear, you're knitting a bunch of pieces and then you have to seam them together. And so I did find, you know, understanding pattern pieces for sewing and other stuff also kind of helps. So I ended up purchasing a couple of knitting patterns, and then I knit my very first vintage sweater, which is my favorite sweater to wear because it's got this big shawl collar. And I live in this sweater. It's got all this beautiful ribbing detail, but I live in this sweater come winter. This is just my favorite thing to put on with a pair of jeans and just hang around the house.
Now, I know that you're a yarnie. Do you use any of your own yarn?
I do use a lot of yarns. Like this yarn here is my yarn. My Rhinebeck sweaters that I just showed you is all my yarn. This is actually from Knit Picks. I forget which yarn brand it is, but it was one of their DK weight yarns that they have. And it comes in a variety of different colors. And I just like, sometimes I think, especially when you're learning something new, they have beautiful yarns at a very reasonable price. And
Right.
So I didn't want to start knitting this sweater in, you know, really expensive, gorgeous yarn and then have it not work out well and then, you know, be really kind of upset, which I think is the dilemma that a lot of people these days have when it comes to knitting new projects or learning new knit skills.
I think that's smart, and I think it's really good advice, especially because today there are some yarns that are not synthetic, not acrylic, but natural, that are at pretty good price points, or they might be 85 or 90% wool and have something synthetic along with them, which brings the price way down too. So
Yeah,
I think that's a really good tip. Tell us your website. Tell us your website so I can get it on the screen.
Well, I'm the owner of Pandia's Jewels. I actually, a few months ago, it like dawned on me that I've been doing this for 9 years now, as far as dyeing yarn and selling it. So, you know, it went by in the blink of an eye. But I do sell like sweater kits and tonals and a lot of hand dyed stuff. But every now and then, there's colors, or especially if you're looking for something that kind of has more of that vintage feel yarn wise, I do feel like Knit Picks and a lot of the yarn brands that they carry, like their City Tweed and some of their other DK and worsted weights kind of fit that. If you're looking for a more authentic vintage look to your knits,
Right.
I think that they have some really reasonable price points as far as knitting a sweater. Because that does get expensive too when you're looking at sweater quantities worth of yarn, and the next thing you know, you have to buy, like 10 or 12 skeins to make a sweater. It can get kind of pricey. So, and it has just a nice hand to it. And I do sometimes like when the yarn does have a little bit of that synthetic or nylon in it, about 5 or 10%, because I do feel that it helps keep the sweater from sagging the more that you wear it. I do know, it depends on the kind of drape and look that you're trying to go for.
Right. They do a cotton that has, I called them on the phone once when I was starting up again as a knitter after a long hiatus. And I said, it's summer and I want to knit something that's cotton, but I don't want 100% cotton because the elbows are going to stretch out and everything is going to sag. And I got someone really helpful and nice, delightful man on the phone. And he said, I recommend this. And I took his recommendation and it was great. They have a cotton that has some small percentage of something stretchy in it, and it's just the right amount. It feels really good. It feels like cotton, but it bounces back.
Well, and the other thing I noticed too is, at least for me anyway, if there's that little bit of that synthetic in there, the sweater doesn't pill as much as, say, sweaters that are normally, like 100% wool. At least that's for me. Because I would also hate to do all that work in this beautiful sweater and then wear it 1 or 2 times and it's just covered in fuzz and pills.
I know Andrea on Fruity Knitting, she gives stuff the rub test.
Yeah.
She looks to see, did it pill? Okay, it's good.
It's good, yeah. And this sweater was actually quite challenging. I had found the pattern for this on Etsy. It was a PDF. And the construction was a little weird, but I think the hardest part I find is finding the right yarn weight. And so I'm not a big swatcher when it comes to sweaters, but I do find that when it comes to knitting vintage patterns, especially trying to find the right size, or if you're altering it to fit your size, swatching is important. And this, I had seen 1 or 2 other people who had done this particular sweater, but they had used a lighter weight yarn, and I ended up going up. I think this is like a DK or a worsted weight in order to get the right gauge and fit for me as far as this construction goes. But I ended up doing a lot of research, and even though I had found the PDF, I then went on to Etsy and ended up finding the actual magazine that the sweater was in, and so that's the cardigan right there.
Is it knit across? Is it knit from one cuff across to the other cuff?
Yeah, what it is you're actually knitting it from
that elbow.
It 2 pieces. So you start the front here, and then you're going to knit up to kind of like where this placard is. And then you're going to put the rest of those stitches on hold, and then you finish working up the top and work the arm across.
Oh, okay.
And then for the other front, you would pick up again and do the rest, and then you pick up the collar and kind of work the collar all the way around, and then the back piece is just one solid piece. And then you end up seaming it along the shoulder. And
that's the thing that's so fascinating about vintage patterns. The construction is so unusual.
And then you end up seaming it down the side. So it's almost like 2 pieces, and you're just sandwiching them together, and the next thing you know, like you have a sweater. And it depends on the vintage pattern. I decided, and for some reason I'm obsessed with Vogue vintage patterns. And so when I did Vogue in January, I decided to do vintage Vogue for Vogue. And I made this beautiful cardigan, which is also from that same magazine, knitting magazine. So I made this beautiful, this is like a raspberry red, and I don't know if you can quite see all of this cabling detail, but it's just tons and tons of cables all along the front. I know it's kind of dark in my...
No, I have light coming from 2 angles at me, and it's a fairly bright day in Manhattan.
So this is was 3 pieces. So you would knit everything. I find that vintage patterns always seem to start from the waist, and I don't really like patterns that start from the waist because I think it's kind of hard to try them on. And for this particular pattern, the collar is actually supposed to fold over, and it won't. It's supposed to go like this, but it never stays like that. It always ends up standing up, but I actually kind of like it.
I like it too.
Standing up. And this pattern starts at the waist, and then you would work the front piece and then extend out for the sleeves, and then you do the same for the back piece. And then I did find these other vintage buttons on Etsy as well. And so this was my vintage Vogue for Vogue. And for this particular one, I had to do 20 swatches to find not only the right gauge, but the right yarn.
What yarn is that? The color's beautiful.
This is my yarn in my
elder.
This is what the color on the website is called elderberry. So it's kind of like a purple raspberry color. And I ended up using a sport weight because I think the other problem is finding, how do I phrase this? Is finding comparable yarns to what the patterns had originally asked for, because a lot of those yarns that they used were discontinued. And so trying to figure out, is that a fingering weight? Even the needles that they suggest are completely different sizes to what we normally use today. And so that's how I ended up doing so many swatches to figure out. You can kind of see it here. That's what it originally looks like in the magazine.
Hang on one second.
The pattern for this one also came out of this magazine, and I have quite a few of them. And depending on where you go, I ended up finding these also on Etsy. I find Etsy a really great source for finding vintage things.
Is this 1950s?
Yes. I think this particular one I want to say is 56 or 57. I do have one that's I want to say that this is summer of 53.
And we're still wearing that today. It's so
I know,
classic.
Twin set. I know.
But even non-vintage people are still wearing. I mean, you can go to like LL Bean and still get vintage. Well, twin sets. They have never gone out of style.
But even this particular style cardigan, I think, has just never really gone out of style. Right. I mean, all over the place. But the other great thing about these books too is I just like the ads too, because the ads also show you like the different yarns and stuff. These 2 particular books came out of the UK. But from my understanding, Vogue shared a lot of their patterns from here and Europe, so a lot of they ended up being the same, like they would recycle them. So a lot of the Vogue magazines too that you find from this era, you might find some similar patterns that, like reprinted in different ones. But I just love looking at like all the old vintage ads with the yarn on there as well.
Adorable.
So finding the right yarn to actually make this particular sweater I found to be a challenge, because it was made by a company called Copley's, and it was their Excelsior line. And then I did a lot of sleuthing, and I actually found it.
Good girl.
On eBay, but I only ended up with 3 skeins. It wasn't enough to make a sweater, but I just wanted to see what kind of actual weight the yarn was, and this definitely looks like I guess what we would call sock weight or a fingering weight today. But with my particular gauge on this one, I ended up using a sport weight, and it worked out pretty well as far as the fit and size. And there was a couple of times where I was actually really worried that once I seamed this together that it wasn't going to fit, and it did. Sigh of relief.
Yes, we know that feeling.
Because you can't really try these on. I mean, with the modern sweaters, like especially if you're doing,
top down,
a more modern raglan type sweater top down, those are really great because you can try them on. Last year I ended up doing 2 Rhinebeck sweaters, and this was my second one. And I'd actually altered the fit on this to give it a more retro kind of a feel, but this was the kind of thing where I could take it on, put it on, take it off, and say, okay, now I need to decrease a little bit more here, knit a couple more rows, try it on, and say, okay, now I'm going to decrease a little bit more. And so this particular sweater, which had a more modern look to it, ended up having like a really nice kind of retro feel to it by the time I was done doing like all of the waist shaping that you would normally find in vintage style sweaters. But you definitely, when you're making from a vintage pattern and you're working all of those pieces, there were a couple of times where I actually held the pieces of this up to this cardigan, as far as like, is this back piece the same width as the back of this one?
I think that's a reasonable strategy. And your mannequin behind you, is it your measurements? Can you pin things onto that?
No, this particular one is not. I do have a dress form that I can alter to my measurements. For some reason, though, I think when you're knitting like flat pieces, it's easier to lay those out on a flat, like on a sweater, you know, laying them out on the table. And then putting one piece on top of each other, and then you can really kind of gauge, I think, a little bit more accurately, like whether or not it's going to fit you, especially big, like, you know, I love this sweater. It fits me perfectly. It was also made in a sport weight. So I knew that if I'm using this as a sport weight, and if I hold these pieces or lay the pieces on top of here and they're fitting or lining up similarly to where it was on this one, then the fit was going to be somewhat accurate as to what it was that I was looking for.
Got it.
But usually people who follow me on Instagram, like on my stories, it's always a journey that everyone seems to follow me when I'm altering or knitting different sweaters.
Tell us your Instagram handle.
You can find me on Instagram as Nimruse, and that's Nimruse. And I have a lot of different yarns, and sometimes I do sweater kits and stuff on there. And this one is also all of my yarns as well.
Great.
And then the other fun thing that I like to do is to just take modern day patterns or vintage reproduction patterns and just kind of alter them, you know, like I did adding the skulls and the bats, or Amy Appel, she's a Poison Girl. She also does a lot of retro sweaters, and so I make Gothic holiday sweaters. This was her sweater inspired by White Christmas. It's her Betty and Judy Lodge sweater, but I just took out the holiday leaves and added some skulls.
Okay.
And this one's also pretty cute because it's got the little keyhole detail on the back of it, where you would just, you know, close it. But it's one of my favorite, I guess, holiday sweaters. But so yeah, it's just one of the little, it's just me. People see me and they're like, ah, that makes sense.
When my hair was as black as yours once upon a time, I definitely wore a lot of black. And of course, there was that whole time period in New York where everyone, whether you were in the fashion world or not, everybody was wearing black. That's how, when we traveled, people knew that we were from New York, because it was like the signature. So I guess in my lifetime, I have been there, that whole black thing. So I get it.
It's just I don't know. It's just a color I always try to get away from, and then I always end up coming back to it. It's just a color that I enjoy wearing, and I think I like it because it's such a neutral background, I think, and it really kind of shows off your hand knits, especially when you wear, you know, something just kind of neutral or plain underneath. It really kind of lets whatever it is that you've knit or made, you know, shine really nicely.
Do you have any other sweaters you want to show us?
No, I think that's kind of all that I brought down with me.
Okay, so tell us about the curio cabinet behind you.
So my husband likes to thrift for furniture. That seems to be his new thing while in quarantine. He likes to explore like the Facebook marketplace and stuff. And so he actually thrifted and found this beautiful curio cabinet that he actually that he refinished for me. Because I had this beautiful collection of depression glass from my grandmother that was sitting in the bottom of a cabinet somewhere, and I really wanted to put it on display. So in the curio cabinet, it has all of the pieces of my grandmother's depression glass.
Oh, lovely.
And this is this little sugar bowl. They all seem to be green, white, and pink are the different pieces that I have. I don't know, there's just something kind of really special about having pieces like this. I mean, no one smokes anymore, but they always made, like ashtrays and...
Oh, look how beautiful it is. I know that there are certain patterns. I know that there's a Madeira pattern, and I don't know all the names, but that intricate, like frosted design on them.
Yeah, there's just a bunch of different ones. And this one, I think I want to say this one's like a little candy dish. So this has the plate, and then here's the little candy dish that would have, you would have put all those little sweets. Although I always remembered my grandmother having like those strawberry candies. They looked like a little strawberry in the wrapper. Those little hard candies that had the soft, like liquid centers was something that my grandmother used to always have in little dishes like this around the house, which was always fun. So yeah, there's just a lot of different, I even have like some ice cream dishes, like little.
Oh, love that. I love that.
Or like ice cream dishes that you would have, used. And they all, it seems the different colors all have different patterns on it. So this one kind of looks like it has strawberries. And this one just has, almost looks like some scroll work on it. But these are all my little favorite pieces that I like to enjoy when we're sitting in here. It's just a few of the vintage things that I like to collect.
Well, I hope that my viewers will be interested in seeing beyond the knitting realm, because I think a lot of people who are watching this have a kind of vintage lifestyle or are aspiring to have that. So if you don't have a grandmother to inherit these from, these things are out there, just like that wool. That is so amazing.
Yeah,
So
and
amazing.
I think this is like the first drop in a bucket of me exploring and looking for more vintage style wools, because it's just, I don't know if I'd ever use it. I don't really, maybe it'll end up in my curio cabinet in one of those nice dishes in there, but
at least the color, the actual color that people of that era were using. And for me, that's exciting. So you might try and match the color. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with yarnsub.com.
It sounds familiar.
That yarn may or may not be in their database, but you could check there and see, because then they will give you what they feel are good substitutions for that.
And I do notice on Pinterest too, there's a few boards of people that have made those kind of charts too, that would say if it was calling for this particular yarn brand or these particular size needles, that this would be the modern day equivalent to, what was used in that particular pattern. But it's still, sometimes it is still a little bit of a guessing game, because I do know that there are still some vintage yarns out there that have not made it into those databases yet. And
of course.
That's where swatching comes in.
Everybody's favorite thing.
Yeah.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It was really great to meet you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year in Rhinebeck.
Yeah, you usually can't miss me at Rhinebeck, because I'm usually the one person walking around with a giant parasol. Whenever I'm outside, I always have an umbrella.
What color is it, so we'll know to look for it?
It's black.
It's black, of course.
But you usually can't miss me. I usually walk around with a big giant black parasol when I'm walking around Rhinebeck. So I'm really looking forward to it next year. I think a lot of us are going to be looking forward to.
I think so. I think it's going to be really exciting. Well, okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Take care.
Yes, enjoy your day.
You too. recording, but okay.
That's fine. So yeah, now you can see a little bit better now that the lights are up in the room.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of cabling, and it goes in one direction and then it crosses the other, and it creates this beautiful lattice, but it was almost like a cable like every 4 or 5 rows.
And there's no chart in this pattern, right?
I don't think there was a chart. I think I ended up making a chart for myself, actually. I think that's what ended up, am I in the right? No, I ended up making a chart for myself because I do design patterns myself for like shawl patterns and stuff. And so I do have like that knitwear software that they use to make charts. There's no chart. The only thing it had was like a tiny little, that's what it's supposed to look like.
Oh, it's not that helpful.
No, it wasn't really helpful. And there's no chart. And then other than that was just like the picture.
Oh, but that picture at least tells 1,000 words. Yeah, that's a little better.
So I ended up,
that looks like an awful lot of work.
Yeah, so I ended up making a chart for myself. That doesn't mean if you don't have the software, you could easily grab some graph paper
of course
and write it out for yourself. And so I think that's what I ended up doing. I do have an actual notebook that's like my vintage knitting notebook, where I actually like will photocopy the pattern and I'll like kind of glue it into the book, and then any additional notes or swatching notes or needle notes or any of that other stuff, or even kind of like end notes. Like if I were to make this again, like if I were to make this vintage sweater again, I'd probably go down a yarn weight because this is a little bit big, which is great for wintertime, but maybe to make like a lighter version, for like, spring or something. So that's not as heavy as this. But yeah, that was a lot of cabling that happened there.
All right, well, I'm glad that we got that on tape.